Joining us now is Hannah Weisfeld, Executive Director and founder of Yachad, a British Jewish organisation supporting a political resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. Will military action, as it's currently is the situation in Gaza, is that the direction you see things going in which you will get a resolution that you're looking for?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately there's no military resolution to this conflict. The only way that the conflict will be resolved long-term is through political resolution. And what's been, I think, so frustrating to see is that for 20 years, the international community has basically ignored Israel-Palestine, you know, occasionally intervene when things haven't kind of the status quo is not holding, and you know we'll intervene and we'll kind of make it clear, you know, that we all wish to see this political resolution but do nothing about it. And now you see people like Blinken, who's running around the Middle East doing shuttle diplomacy, suddenly realising that 20 years of stagnation has resulted in this terrible conflict that is costing so many human lives, that ultimately is going to end the same way, which is through, you know, a political resolution that we tried, you know, we have tried and not succeeded in getting before, but that's largely because the international community has washed its hands of both the Palestinian and the Israeli people, I think. What I hope will happen, and it's not clear at the moment that there is enough kind of international political will for this, but what I hope will happen is that the international community will start putting in place the groundwork for that political resolution. At the moment, the discussion is focused around should there be a ceasefire, should there not, but there isn't really any talk of the politics of that and how you bring the parties to the table. That's completely missing from the conversation at the moment.
The tenure of Netanyahu as Prime Minister, there's a lot of controversy over that. It's not universally popular. How key is his position as PM to the future of this conflict?
Well, I think it's highly unlikely that he will last. He might last the war, you know, however long that goes on for, but he is universally unpopular. I mean, he was unpopular in Israel prior to this conflict. So for those following what was going on there was huge divisions in Israeli society, very split, and he was seen to be the person that was undoing democracy inside Israel. Now, you know, the one thing he had, Netanyahu, was Mr. Security. That the one thing I can deliver to the Israeli people is security. And on his tenure and under his watch, Israel has had the worst security breach in its history, and actually the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, which is a terrible legacy for a man who says he can deliver security to the Israeli people. There is no way that he will last beyond the conflict.
There's been a lot of talk about the potential for a two-state solution. I think often when we cover stories like these, we say phrases like that without actually going into the real detail of what that would entail. Can you just give us a brief breakdown of what that would mean and whether it's actually achievable?
Well, the question about whether it's achievable, you know, and I said this to someone the other day, there isn't another choice. So we hear people talking about one unified state between the river and the sea. And I have to say that when you look at what's happened in the last 4 weeks, last month now, the idea that the Israeli and the Palestinian people can live in one unified democratic state, I think is kind of a fantasy in its fairy tales. I don't think there's any other choice, that you will have two states in which the Palestinian and the Israeli people can live in dignity and security. What that means practically is that Gaza and the West Bank there will have to be a physical way. For those of who don't know the map so well, Israel is in between them.
Sure.
So there has to be a physical way to unite those two pieces of territory, and the Palestinian people have to have democratic rule over that as a joint unified piece of territory, with Israel that will, you know, in between. It's practically not straightforward. But in reality, there's no other choice. And what that means on a real practical level is that there has to be a way to divide the city of Jerusalem. A lot of people don't really kind of realise that East Jerusalem has to be the Palestinian capital. West Jerusalem has to be the capital of Israel. And both peoples need to be able to raise their flag and have secure borders and live in dignity and security. There are over 600,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank. A significant number of them will have to leave. And what's going on the ground today, and this is largely being overlooked because of Gaza, but there's huge unrest inside the West Bank. There's a huge amount of settler violence. I think over 140 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed in the last 30 days by a mix of settlers and the IDF.
And Hamas aren't present in the West Bank?
No, Hamas is present in the West Bank, but it doesn't rule the West Bank. The West Bank is ruled by Fatah and by the Palestinian Authority. But you have now in the West Bank, which is hugely problematic, you have settlers, extreme settlers, who are committing violence against Palestinians. And unfortunately, some of their political leadership is a part of this Israeli government. Yep. So they are effectively given free rein to run around Palestinian communities and chase people out of their homes, which is what's happening every day at the moment.
We've seen, historically, there are things that have worked, there are things that haven't worked. Camp David is an obvious example of the Egyptian-Israeli situation there. We remember the Israeli Prime Minister and Arafat with Clinton at the White House. I mean, these things have happened before. It's got close. It's never been solved. I mean, you mentioned the two-state solution, Nicola, and people have agitated for that, saying that must be the answer. Who has to get involved, do you sense, in order to make at least the beginning of some progress?
Well, I mean, one small silver lining, a piece of optimism, which is that in 1973, the Yom Kippur War, which a lot of people are comparing this, exactly 50 years ago, Israel made peace with Egypt 6 years later. And it was inconceivable when Egypt had invaded Israel 6 years earlier and put it under, existential threat, that there could be a peace agreement. That's not a warm peace, but it's held for 50 years. And Israel is much safer as a result of that peace agreement. Its borders are much safer. So it is possible that out of terrible darkness, things can change. I think in terms of what happens next, unless the international community, unless America particularly, and the Arab world actually, forces those two parties around the table, it's going to be very hard, because there is no political will inside Israel and inside the occupied Palestinian territories to speak to the other side. There was already very little political will, and now, for obvious reasons, there's really none at all. When I speak to people inside Israel, the perception there is we are under existential threat, and what's going on in Gaza is really awful, but we have no choice. But there is context. It doesn't justify what Hamas did, but there is context, which is political stagnation. And so if we want to stop this from happening again, there is going to have to be a very concerted effort by the international community, backed by supporters of Israel and Palestinians around the world, to force the parties into an agreement.
Hannah Weisfeld, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I could talk to you for hours, but we have to move on, sadly.